Daniel chapter 6, probably one of the better known Bible stories in the entire scripture, maybe, to those who don't study super well. But this is one of the famous ones, right? You have Noah in the ark, you have Jonah in the whale, and then you have Daniel in the lion's den. And that's what we're going to cover this morning in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6 begins with the phrase, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom." Now again, as a means of context, who is this Darius guy? Who is this? We went through Nebuchadnezzar, and then in chapter 5 we went through Belshazzar, who was the last king of Babylon. And in fact, chapter 5, verse 30 ends with these two verses. "The very night that the handwriting on the wall thing happened, that very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean, the Babylonian king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old." I know it's been 2 weeks, but we did go through this towards the end of the lesson last time. As the handwriting on the wall was occurring, probably we believe the Medes and the Persian army was marching under the gates of Babylon, going up through the gates that led down to the river, infiltrating the city and taking over the city, kind of a surprise attack. And according to most accounts, very little actual fighting was done because they totally didn't see them coming. Babylon didn't see the other army coming. And they took over the city with kind of minimal effort as far as actual combat goes. And Belshazzar receives this writing on the wall as the enemy is marching under the gate. And he calls in Daniel, and Daniel reads the words as the soldiers are marching up through the city towards the castle. And it says that very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed. And the new king that takes over to start the new empire is called Darius the Mede here in Scripture. There is some question about who exactly is Darius the Mede. Again, I'm no historian. Somebody can correct me afterwards if I'm wrong. But secular history, which records kind of this whole event as well, can't really find a Darius the Mede really in their records. And so people ask, well, who is Darius the Mede that's in Daniel if he's not really recorded elsewhere in history? There are two theories. We won't spend a ton of time on it because it's really not what the story is about here in the book of Daniel. Some people think Darius the Mede is another name for Cyrus, the emperor. Personally, I'm not sure I take that view. It could be, I could be wrong. But Daniel calls Darius the Mede, and at the end of chapter 6, he calls Cyrus the what? The Persian. Darius the Mede, Cyrus the Persian. Are they the same guy? I tend to think not. The Medes and the Persians were two separate groups. Yes, they merged to form the empire, but do you call the same guy two different sides? Yeah, I don't think so. The other theory is that Darius would have actually been either a general or a lower guy under Cyrus, but Cyrus set up different governors and sub-leaders in the different areas that he conquered, right? Babylon was not the only city he conquered. He conquered other areas, and when he did so, he would put one of his guys, his generals, his vice emperors in the different areas where he conquered to help rule and maintain. Personally, I think that's probably who Darius the Mede was. The Medes were heavy in the army and in the military. Probably he came in, put one of his chief military guys over Babylon to rule while Cyrus went around and conquered other areas. That's my personal opinion. I could be wrong, but that's probably who he is. But regardless, Darius the Mede was made king, and the politics changed immediately, literally overnight. And now instead of in the Babylonian Empire, when you wake up the next morning, you live in the Medes and the Persians Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. What does the timing look between Daniel chapter 5 and Daniel chapter 6? Again, sadly, the Bible doesn't really say. I always look for details. I wish I could kind of get the whole picture, and sometimes I wish there were more detail than what was there. Obviously, God put in what he wanted to put in, and I can't complain about it. But it'd sure be fun to know the exact timing. Again, my personal opinion is I think this all happened really quickly. In fact, I think, all of chapter 6, in my opinion, happened pretty soon after chapter 5. Ezra chapter 1 kind of gives us another clue, maybe, about how things happen. In Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 the first few verses. It says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the very first year, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and beasts, besides free will offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And again, we read that passage and we think, how in the world would a pagan emperor, this Persian guy, write something like this? He praises the God of Israel. He says, hey, all you Jews that came from Jerusalem originally, gather up your stuff. Feel free to go on back. I'd like to rebuild the temple of the God of Israel in Jerusalem, because he is the God, the Lord, the God of heaven. He has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He acknowledges God's power in granting him the success that he has. Doesn't it seem a little weird that a pagan, non-Jewish emperor makes a proclamation like this, sends the Jews back and says, hey, why don't you rebuild the temple of your God back in Jerusalem, because he's the God that belongs there, and he's the God that gave me the power that I have. What in the world makes a pagan king write something like that? Could it be that he, shortly before this, had an encounter with that very God in which he, if you can say it, if God earns his respect, I know God doesn't have to earn anybody's respect, but you know what I'm saying, an encounter with a God where he recognizes God's true power and who God really is, that makes him write a proclamation like this. Well, what in the world kind of encounter could Cyrus have had with the true God of Israel that gains the kind of respect that would be necessary to make him want to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem? Could it be that maybe one of his people got thrown in a lion's den and was miraculously, say, rescued? Maybe that could have been an influencing factor in this proclamation in Ezra. Personally, I think it probably was. If that's the case, and if we know that the Jews went back in the first year of Cyrus, that means that the end of chapter 5 and the events of chapter 6 take place within a year. No more than, probably a few months, really. So Daniel gives the interpretation of the writing on the wall. The Persians march in, and what do they see? They see, here's the king, here's Belshazzar. Of course, Nabonidus, his father, ruler number 1, was elsewhere. He had already been captured. Ruler number 2, Belshazzar, he's standing there shaking in his boots. They know he has to be gotten rid of. But who else do they see? There's Daniel, who has just been promoted to ruler number 3, which, since they eliminated ruler number 1 and 2, I guess kind of technically by default makes him ruler number 1 in Babylon. And so it kind of makes sense of what we see that comes up in chapter 6, how since the Medes and the Persians, Cyrus was known for, when he would take over an area, he'd leave a lot of the leadership and the customs and the religious worship intact, in place, in wherever it was that he captured. This eliminates a power vacuum. It eliminates having to set up a whole new structure. It also buys the goodwill of the people, right? When the invading people come in and say, we will be kind and let you keep doing what you've always done, worship the way you worship, your governmental structure will stay largely the same, only we ultimately call the shots now. And that buys the goodwill of the people. There's less likely a revolt later on because the people are more happy because they keep with their way of life and everything they're used to. And it's a brilliant move, politically speaking. So they come into Babylon, they say, hey, look, here's a highly revered leader. He's just been promoted. He just predicted our own victory, which we just accomplished. Clearly, he is a brilliant man. Why don't we use him, in our administration? And so they set him up in a very, very high place in the next empire. And that's where we find him in Daniel chapter 6. So let's read through the first few verses of Daniel chapter 6. Verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom. Again, the way it's worded, I don't know for sure, but it sounds like this is kind of very early in his reign, which again kind of supports our whole timeline here. Verse 2, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give an account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Not only was he brilliant, but again, I think what he's saying here is we're going to keep the most brilliant guys from the previous kingdom working for us so that there's no transitional loss, no extra fighting. Things will keep continuing on smoothly, and we don't have to worry about it. Verse 3, then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. You can kind of see where this is going. Verse 4, then the high officials and the satraps, who were just placed under Daniel, sought to find ground for a complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Why did they not like Daniel in the first place? Why try to find fault with a faultless guy? Probably they were jealous and didn't like having him set over him so immediately. We've seen this before. Verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any ground for complaint against Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. They knew he had one, besides everything else that he did really well, he had one distinguishing characteristic, one, can you call it a flaw? One trait. He always worshiped his God. He is super faithful in this. He is known to do that. So if we're going to find anything wrong with him, it's not going to be in his work, because he does everything really well, and he's a lot of integrity. But if we can find a way to nail him on his worship, we've got him. Verse 6, then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king. It's a total collusion, right? Here's Russian collusion right here. High officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors, the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. What is going on here? What causes Darius to have such a super ego boost all of a sudden and sign this thing, this law that says nobody is to, technically it doesn't say pray to, it says make an injunction, make a request of anybody else for 30 days. Why do you think he would do that? Especially in light of what I've already said. This reign, these rulers in general were known for being, for promoting justice, for promoting goodwill, for having a lot of tolerance for the other cultures they capture, being very accommodating to their captees. Captees, is that a word? The people they captured, their subjects. Being known for very tolerant, very understanding, very accommodating to the people they captured. So why would this guy, this administration, who's known for being tolerant to those he captures, make a decree that for 30 days, not forever, just 30 days, 1 month, nobody is to, and again, it didn't specifically say pray, it said make a request to or make an injunction to anybody else except for Darius. What's going on? It seems a little out of character for this administration, a little bit weird. Something doesn't add up. Unless he was trying to set up his authority and concrete his authority early in his administration. Personally, I kind of think that's what was going on. He just steps into the throne. He says, here's a people in the middle of a city that was a capital of the previous empire. I can see where there would be a lot of unrest, maybe some fighting to try to take back the city, something like that. I need something to concrete my political power, to make everybody realize that I'm the one in charge here. So the governors come to him and say, hey, king, we have an idea for you. To just stick it in everybody's mind, why don't you make a law by the Medes and the Persians which cannot be revoked? A king who wrote this type of legislation, even himself, didn't have a right to reverse it. Saying that anybody who makes an official request, again, not just any request, right? The kid sitting at the dinner table, hey, pass me the bread, please. Hey, you asked a request of somebody else against the king. I don't think that's what he was talking about, but an official, large-scale request, other than against the king, gets thrown in the lion's den. What would that do for him politically? Well, for 1 month, which is probably about how long it takes to get into a good habit, a good mindset, everybody knows this is the guy in charge. He is now ruling the city. Personally, I can't prove this from Scripture, but I think that's probably what was going on. I think it was more than just a little ego stroke. I think he was establishing his authority and his reign in this newly created empire, and he doesn't want any quells of rebellion trying to take back the city. So for 30 days, he says, this sounds like a good idea. I think this is maybe what I should do. Of course, the king didn't realize the ulterior motive of his governors at this point. He just says, yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. For 30 days, no more. I mean, I don't want to cause unrest among the people, and this is going to be a headache for people, but for 1 month, I am the only one that anybody can make an official petition towards. Sound good? Sound reasonable? Can you kind of see maybe where he was coming from on this? Foolish move? Yes, absolutely. But given where he was, can you kind of see why he might have signed it? Yeah, kind of. Again, not a good move, but probably where he was coming from. This whole story is interesting and almost kind of familiar, right? You have the king who sets up a demand of worship or petition in front of all the people as a means of establishing his kingdom. You have a guy who is known for his worship, who comes into conflict with this new edict, and this new edict carries with it a huge consequence, right? Death, essentially, is the consequence. And the king and the worshiping guy, in this case Daniel, come into conflict. The worshiping guy refuses to back down. The king either cannot or will not back down. The worshiping guy is thrown to his death, well, supposedly his certain death, and yet is miraculously rescued by God and is brought back out of his chamber of death. And the king, after all this is done, makes a proclamation of praise to the God of the worshiper, in this case Daniel, to the whole kingdom. Does this plot line sound familiar to anybody? It just seems like in the back of my mind we've heard this basic storyline somewhere before. Can anybody place it with me? Help me out. Can anybody place this story before? There's a little deja vu going on here. I can't figure it out. Did I hear somebody say it? Sounds almost exactly like what we heard, isn't it, in Daniel chapter 3. The king issues a proclamation of worship. Everybody worships me. The worshipers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or Daniel, depending on your chapter, says, no, we will not do this. I will worship the true God only. The king says, all right, then you're going to die. He throws him into the fire or the lion's den. God rescues him, pulls him out. The king is super amazed at the power of the God of Israel and makes a proclamation to the whole country, the whole empire, saying, this is the true God, worship him. It's really the exact same story repeated all over again, only with a new king and a new emperor and a new empire. God's reintroducing himself again to Darius in exactly the same way he did to Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 3. I just thought that was fascinating. But as we continue through the story here of chapter 6, as God replays this one more time for Darius, again, we see the governors, they are using Daniel's religion against him. They're using religion and politics for what is really a personal attack. This is not the point of the story, but I think we can see politics in play here again. And when we see it in our own day, we can be not surprised or shocked or say, wow, this is so corrupt. We've never seen anything like this before. This has been going on forever. So when you look in the newspaper and you see personal attacks being carried out using either religion or politics to further one's political agenda, this is not a new thing. It's been going on for millennia. Okay, but continuing on, read in verse 6. Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement, again, to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the officials, blah, 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 think it would be a good idea for you to write a law that says, no petitions to any god or man for 30 days except for you, or they will be cast into the lions. Now king, establish the injunction, sign the document, so that it cannot be changed according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. He signs the document and the injunction. Continue to verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber, open towards Jerusalem. And he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before the Lord, before his God, as he had done previously. Again, how did the bad guys, the governors, know that this would be a good way to trap him? Because he did this all the time, very regularly. They knew it would be an easy catch if they could get the king to sign this decree, which he did. Verse 11, then these men came, what's the next phrase? Again, by agreement, by collusion, and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. I can kind of picture him standing outside the window, or maybe they snuck in the back way to the back door of the living room and looked through. Whatever, they all showed up at the appointed meeting time. All right, guys, we're going to catch Daniel at 6 o'clock tonight. Everybody be there. It'll be a great time. We'll catch him making this decree, and we'll go to the king first thing in the morning, and it'll be all good. And so they showed up. Sure enough, they were not disappointed. He was praying. After they catch him, verse 12, then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? King, didn't you sign this law? You remember this law that you signed? Didn't you actually sign it? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Yes, I signed it. It is stamped. It is written in stone. Can't be changed back. You have my word on that, he says to his governors. Then they dropped the bomb. Verse 13. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles of Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. And king, we gotcha. They knew full well that he would be praying. They knew he'd be consistent in his prayer life, that his worship was the only thing they could nail him on, which says a ton about Daniel, by the way, and how good he is. Again, as good of an example as this is, I don't think Daniel's prayer life is the whole point of the story, although, yes, we can certainly learn from it and see it as a good example for us to follow. That we should all be known for how consistently we worship and pray and serve God. Wouldn't that be great? And if everybody outside in our work that's looking to take a shot at us or stab us in the back or whatever it is says they're a really good person, the only way I can get at them is by their beliefs, that'd be a compliment. But that's what the people did before King Darius. So they come back to Darius and they say, didn't you actually sign this? They make him repeat it out of his own mouth. And they say, I'm glad you said that, because we have an offender for you. It is Daniel, your favorite chosen governor, who you are going to set over the whole kingdom, the role model for everyone. He's the one that doesn't pay attention to you, Darius, and he has violated your law. Verse 14, then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then, verse 15, then these men came, what's the next phrase? By agreement, again, to the king, and said to the king, know now, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Why do you think they came back later and repeated that statement to Darius? Because they wanted to make sure he didn't try to weasel out of what he had originally written, right? It says in verse 14, when he heard the words, he was distressed, he was upset. Why do you think he's distressed and upset? Because he was losing his best guy, Daniel? Probably so. Because he knew he did something wrong? Probably so, yeah. Because he felt embarrassed and ticked off that he knew he'd just been steamrolled by his own governors, that he'd been tricked and blindsided into signing this stupid thing that he signed, all so that they could take him out, which I'm sure he knew at this point was for jealousy or political reasons, and he felt like a moron because he'd just been tricked by his own people. I think that's probably a big part of it too. And so he set his mind to deliver Daniel. How can I get out of this? They just made me repeat out of my own mouth that it cannot be revoked, that I signed this thing myself as a royal decree, can't be changed. Now what do I do? How can I get out of this? And he couldn't find a way. There was no way. So they come back to him. He thinks about this. I don't know what time of day they came to him initially when they dropped the bomb on him, but it says he spent the rest of the day. He labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Was that all day? Did they come to him at noon and just the afternoon? I don't know. Doesn't matter. But he spent as much time as he could before the sentence had to be carried out at the end of the day to try to figure out a way, some kind of loophole to get out of it. He could not find one. Well, verse 16 continues. Then the king commanded, begrudgingly, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, "May your God, whom you serve continually, deliver you." And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords. Who are the lords, do you think? Probably the ones who had made the accusation. King has to seal it, and those governors, those lords, those sub-rulers were more than happy to put their seal on that stone. Ain't nobody moving that stone. Bye-bye, Daniel. See you later. And they walked away. That nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Verse 18, then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. I'll bet it did. And he was up all night thinking, worrying, wondering what would happen. Now again, what do you think was worrying the king so much that night? What kept him from going to sleep? What kept him from being in the mood for any kind of entertainment or food or anything that he usually did? Any kind of enjoyment. He goes there and his mind is running at 1,000 miles an hour. What was he thinking about? What do you think? Put yourself in his mind. What's going through your mind? He's worried about his number one guy who just got thrown in the lion's den. He said earlier, and it's interesting, may your God who you serve continually deliver you. And again, we don't know from Scripture for sure. What do you think he meant by that? Did he really think that the God of Israel would save Daniel from the mouth of the lions? I don't know for sure. Personally, if I had to guess, I'd doubt it. I mean, he was a pagan guy. But did he really expect God to save Daniel? I don't know. It was enough that he went back early in the morning. We'll read that in just a minute. But maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Maybe it was just a well-wish. Daniel, hey, good luck to you. Sorry I can't get out of it. You prayed to your God. I hope he comes through for you here. But not really be sincere in thinking he would? I don't know. Was it Daniel's safety that was keeping him up? Or was it sheer anger at his other governors for being duped and steamrolled and tricked into signing this thing? I can see that as being a big part of it too. I think he was so mad at being manipulated in that way. I am the emperor here, I am the king, and you just totally pulled the wool over my eyes so that I would kill my number one guy just for political purposes. Who's really in charge here? Is it the king or is it the governors? Right now it's the governors. Sir?
He also could have been fearful that God would flip his kingdom like he flipped the Babylonian kingdom.
It could be. If he really had that much fear and acknowledgement of the true God of Israel. And again, that's really what it comes down to. How much regard does he have for the God of Israel? If he really had a high regard and worship for the true God, then A, when he said what he said to Daniel, he would have meant it. And B, he would have known that God can give the kingdom to whoever he wants. My personal opinion is he probably wasn't a worshiper to that degree at this time. I could be wrong. Bible doesn't say. I don't know. I think he was still a pagan guy. But it could be. That could be. And by the end of the chapter, I think we can definitely see him coming around to that. At this point, I'm not sure he's sold on it. But I could be wrong. We'll see. Bible doesn't specifically say. Continuing on. Where did I leave break? Verse 19. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came near to the den where Daniel was, and he cried out in a tone of anguish. Again, if you really expected Daniel to be saved, I can't imagine it would be English. No, it probably wasn't English at all, no. Or anguish either. But he cried out in anguish. He said, I think he was expecting the worst, to be honest. But again, cries out in anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, who you serve continuously, been able to deliver you from the lions? Verse 21, then Daniel said to the king, O king, from down in the hole, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Verse 23, Then the king was exceedingly glad, and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Again, I can't help but flash back to chapter 3, where the guys walk out of the furnace and you can't even smell smoke on them, and not a hair of their head was singed. Perfectly fine. And here comes Daniel. No harm was found on him. I wonder too, and I was kind of reading up about the lion's dens at that time. They usually, according to what I read, usually had a hole at the top where you drop people in, and then also a side door where the caretakers or whatever could get in and clean the cages periodically and stuff. So 2 doors, one at the top, one at the side. Probably the side one was the one that they sealed to make sure nobody could, break in, try to rescue Daniel or whatever. No harm comes to him. Now Daniel at this time, if our timeline is right, is probably at least in his 70s. Some people say 80s. So he's not a teenager anymore like he was when he was brought to Babylon. Even with no lions, how do you drop a 70-year-old down into a stone hole and he comes out with no harm on him? Forget the lions, even just the drop itself. But then you add in a whole bunch of angry, hungry lions, and he comes out completely unharmed. Truly miraculous, for sure. But we continue. Where are we here? Verse 23. Daniel was taken out of the den. No kind of harm was found on him because he trusted in his God. And the king commanded. Here's where we kind of get some insight into the king's mind. The king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. He says, all right, Daniel's made it out. He was innocent before me, and amazingly, his God rescued him. There's a lot going on here, but before I dig into that, I have been tricked and humiliated by my guys. I think it's time for a little payback. And immediately he calls for those accusers and brings them in. And it says, those who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, and their children and their wives. Everybody, the whole family is getting punished for this. I'm so furious. I'm so angry. I'm so humiliated. I don't trust you anymore. You're trying to usurp my power. You're trying to manipulate me. You're going into the lion's den now. And by the way, why don't we just kill your whole family while I'm at it, because I'm super ticked. And I guess this was kind of a thing that Persian kings would do at that time. If one person really committed a high crime, treason or whatever, their whole family would be killed, just, as punitive damage or whatever. And that's what he did here. He saw this as high enough crime, their whole family's going in. Kind of feel bad for the little kids who didn't really have anything to do with this, but they got thrown in the lion's den too. The end of verse 24. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones to pieces. Why is that even in there? Again, I think we're to contrast that with Daniel. Daniel, the 70-plus-year-old frail guy, thrown into the stone pit full of lions, comes out completely unharmed. And we wonder about just the stone floor beyond the lions. God shut the mouths of the lions. We see that in Daniel in just a couple minutes. You almost wonder, did the lions somehow get together and catch Daniel on the way down? I mean, I don't know. The Bible doesn't say, but it makes you wonder. Did God kind of orchestrate the lions? All right, the lions kind of stand in a row here. Bend your legs a little bit so they're nice and springy because you got a load coming down. Oh, thank you. I don't know. Somehow he came out unharmed. I mean, if they threw me down there, I'd come out with a broken hip or something from hitting the ground. Daniel comes out unharmed. These guys didn't have to worry about the floor either. Isn't that nice? They never hurt themselves on the floor because they were dead by the time they got there. Why is that in the Bible? It contrasts Daniel's predicament, his situation, with the other guys. This is no ordinary lion situation. Not only did he close their mouths, he kept Daniel from all harm. The other guys, the lions are so... In the first case, they are unnaturally calm. In the second case, they are unnaturally vicious. They caught these guys mid-air, ripped them to shreds before they ever hit the ground. So brutal was their attack. So overwhelming was God's judgment in this situation, where God says, you are innocent, you are not, and you are going to survive completely unharmed. You're not going to even hit the ground before you're dead. Huge statement by the all-powerful God, and Darius sees this. He knows what's going on, which leads us to verse 25. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, the nations, the languages that dwell in all the earth. He says, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. And here's his decree. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed. His dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. And just like we said before, I don't think Daniel being pulled out of the pit is the climax of the story here. I mean, plot-wise maybe, yeah, but in terms of the chapter and why it's here, I don't think Daniel coming out is the highlight of the story. I think the highlight and the point of the story are these last couple verses where Darius recognizes who God is and says, whoa, we got a real God going on here. It's the God of Daniel. It's the God of the Jews. He's the real God. He's the one that grants power, like you were saying. He's the one that gives me my authority to do what I can do, and he's the one that calls the shots. And in my mind, it's no mystery now why shortly thereafter there would be another decree come out from the highest levels of government saying what? Jews of the kingdom, I think it is fitting that you go back and rebuild your God's temple in Jerusalem as a means of honoring him, because he's the real God, and he's the one that needs to be worshipped. I'm going to give you all kinds of money and resources and whatever you guys need. You go back, you rebuild your God's temple, because he is the one that calls the shots. Now, at this point, could it have been, so that he blesses me and my kingdom? Probably, maybe a big part of it. Again, we don't know his mind for sure. But after this, he recognizes God's true power. So, once again, this chapter ends with a royal proclamation to the empire that the God of Israel, the God of Daniel, is the true God. The people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. That's his proclamation. Now, just to recap what we've seen in Daniel so far, because again, I really think we're supposed to kind of compare these. I hope you can see that print up there. It's a little small. Chapter 1, God makes his followers, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel specifically, better than all of their competitors when they choose to follow God instead of the false gods. Chapter 2, God interprets the dream. God is declared by Nebuchadnezzar to be a revealer of mysteries. Chapter 3, God rescues from the fire. Again, another royal proclamation. Anyone that speaks against the God of Israel, Yahweh, dies. Chapter 4, God humbles Nebuchadnezzar, turns him into a beast. Another proclamation, royal proclamation. His dominion is everlasting. He does according to his will. Chapter 5, the writing on the wall. In this case, there was no royal proclamation. Why? The poor guy didn't live long enough to write one. Would there have been one had he lived? We don't know for sure. But we do see that what was written on the wall came to pass immediately, and Daniel, who is the follower of the true God, is promoted. And finally, now in chapter 6, the Daniel and the lion's den story. Another proclamation, tremble and fear before the God of Israel. He delivers and rescues. Every chapter here, except for 1 and 5, which doesn't really work out, but everyone where there's a chance, a royal proclamation at the end of the chapter extolling the power and the virtue and the wisdom and the almightiness and the sovereignty of God. Every last one of them. What are we supposed to see from this series of stories? Not hard to figure out. Who's the real God? Who's really in charge? And he makes this proclamation to the entire kingdom, proclaiming who he is, reassuring his people that God is still in charge. He's with them in the exile, and he will keep his promises. We are about out of time. I was going to do a little bit more, but maybe we'll catch it next week quick. We'll see. Let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, we thank you this morning when we can go through the story of Daniel. The lion's den, the famous story that we all know. You showed your power so many times. And again, the story is not the story. Daniel isn't about Daniel, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego isn't about the three guys. Each one of these is about who you are and your power, your sovereignty in the affairs of people, how you put people up, you set people down. Help us to recognize who you are, especially as we go into now the next part of the book, where you start proclaiming what will be in the days to come. And you take all of that sovereignty and that authority that you've established in the first half of the book, and you use it in the second half of the book to proclaim what will be in the future years. And we know that we can trust what goes on there because you've already demonstrated who you were in the first 6 chapters. Help us to trust your word and recognize your authority. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.